What makes a place? Maybe you'd say a place is defined by its geography or the legal basis it has to exist. I personally say that a place is defined by its people. Allow me to provide a personal example. I'm originally from Ireland, a place that's known for having produced storytellers and rebels, and most importantly, not being English. However, people are also known as drunkards and as redheads and other negative or just untrue stereotypes that don't paint the whole picture. But then I moved over to the other side of my room, to the United States of America, where my mother's from, specifically living in Washington, Montana, and now Idaho. Let's hone in on Montana because, well, I need some sort of segue into the main point of this video. When someone thinks of the people that made Montana what it is today, they likely think of cowboys and Indians, or some sort of western rancher or cowboy that perfectly fits that rugged individualist idea of the American West. Maybe they think of Kevin Costner from Yellowstone or Brad Pitt from Legends of the Fall. However, the focus of this video is going to be the Irish of Montana. During the famine and the decades following, many Irish went to America and elsewhere seeking refuge from the miserable poverty of their colonised homeland. Upon arrival in the States, the Irish often faced discrimination in access to work. This discrimination led many westward to states like Montana, specifically mining towns like Butte and Anaconda, where work was available to them and where they could establish their life. Some, like Irish-born copper king Marcus Daly, found great success. Daly managed to build a great mining establishment with the Anaconda Company and had preference for hiring those of Irish stock. Irish influence grew in local and state politics and with the creation of various Irish organisations. By 1900 in Butte, Silverbow, a quarter of the population were Irish or first-generation Americans from Irish families. Even today, Butte can claim to be the most Irish town in the country, with nearly a quarter of its residents claiming Irish ancestry, even more than the famously Irish Boston. Amongst the wave of Irish migration to Montana was Thomas Francis Meagher. However, he came not as a refugee or trying to find work where he couldn't elsewhere, but as a statesman. Thomas Francis Meagher is celebrated in Ireland for his contributions to Irish nationalism and the fight against British rule, and, as I would find out, he's distinctly celebrated in his adopted land. Thomas Francis Meagher was born in Waterford in the southeast of Ireland in 1823. From an upper-class political background, he developed his skills as an orator at colleges in Ireland and later England. Upon finishing his education, he returned to Ireland where he became involved with the repeal movement, which sought to repeal the Acts of Union 1800 that had brought the Kingdom of Ireland in union with the Kingdom of Great Britain, thus creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Inspired by the American and French revolutions, Meagher argued against pacifism and became a leader in the Young Irelander movement, which sought Irish independence even if through armed struggle. In a display of his skills as an orator, Meagher said in a speech, "Abhor the sword? Stigmatise the sword? No, my lord, for at its blow, and in the quivering of its crimson light, a giant nation sprang up from the waters of the Atlantic, and by its redeeming magic the fettered colony became a daring, free republic." In 1848, the Irish flag as it is now known, the green, white and orange tricolour, was adopted by Meagher after having been presented it in France, the design inspired by the French flag. That same year, Meagher participated in a failed insurrection and was arrested, tried and convicted of treason against the British. Originally sentenced to death, his sentence was commuted to a life of exile in Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania, Australia. In 1852, though, Meagher escaped his exile and came to the United States, settling in New York. His arrival was welcomed by Irish Americans, as many were already well aware of who he was and what he had done for the Irish cause. Demonstrations were held, articles promoted him, organisations rallied around him. He made some public appearances where he spoke of his time in exile and of the continuing Irish struggle, but initially wanted to remain out of politics. However, he began to study law, spoke at lectures, and became a journalist, advocating for the Irish in America. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Meagher had felt kinship with Southern aristocrats and had lectured throughout the region, but by the firing upon Fort Sumter, Meagher was back in the Union and actively recruited Irishmen to join the Union Army, himself serving as captain of Company K of the 69th New York Regiment, and later raising an Irish Brigade. The brigade fought with valour in multiple battles, with Meagher leading as Brigadier General. However, casualties tallied up, including Meagher injuring his knee. In May 1863, frustrated with how the brigade was being used and the Union not raising more soldiers, Meagher resigned. However, his resignation was rescinded in December, and he was shuffled around various leadership positions in Ohio and Tennessee. After the end of the Civil War, he was appointed as the Secretary for the Montana Territory by President Andrew Johnson, and soon after assumed the role of acting governor. I didn't take an interest in Thomas Francis Meagher until after I left Montana. Frankly, I didn't take an interest in the state or its history until after leaving. By extension, I didn't realise there was a statue of him just hanging out in front of the Capitol building in Helena. This Irishman, so important to Irish history, just immortalised in the state I was living in? Gosh, I really wish I could have seen it. So, I went. With my buddies Curtis and Josh, we drove from Bozeman all the way to Helena to finally see the statue of Thomas Francis Meagher. Was it all that we expected it to be? Well, it actually ended up being quite different than I thought it would be. So much so that I had to reorient my narrative for this video essay. While researching the statue, I was under the impression it took on an exclusively American identity that made no reference to his Irish background. One of the sources I used, the only one with the specifics about what was written on the statue, listed 3 panels of information, all about his American contributions. So, colour me surprised when I go to the statue in person and find that there are 6 panels of information. You have to walk to the other side of the statue to see them. Panels with information that actually went fairly in depth about who he was as an Irishman. I did go ahead and submit an edit request to the website, so now it'll have all the panels. The largest silence is actually his tenure as the governor of Montana. There's some references to his values, but nothing about what he accomplished. So now I had to look at this differently, because, well, crap. It does immortalise him and recognise him as an Irishman. But what makes him worthy of being immortalised as a Montanan? I ask that question because his reverence extends beyond just this statue. Here's Meagher Avenue in Bozeman. Here's the Thomas Meagher Bar in Missoula. Heck, he even has a whole county named after him. Thomas Meagher is all around. So he must have been quite an impactful governor, right? Well, as far as the actions of his governorship are concerned, I don't think he had the successes that would normally warrant someone to be immortalised in such a fashion. That's not a critique of his values, which I'll get into. Early into his tenure, Meagher, a Democrat, found himself at loggerheads with the Republican justices of the territory. He lost their favour when he pardoned a fellow Irishman who had been arrested and convicted of killing another man in a brawl. Though Meagher could suspend the death penalty of a prisoner, he could not, under territory law, release or pardon a prisoner, but he did so anyway after being petitioned. This also caused him to lose favour with elements of the media, with accusations of Meagher being a drunkard. Meagher's personal goal of statehood for the territory was also a failure of his tenure. He called for a constitutional convention. Delegates drafted one, however, it failed with the public. The aspect of his governorship that intrigued me the most was his interactions with the Native American groups of the area, made ever more striking to me given that his statue is surrounded by the flags of Montana's recognised tribal nations. Meagher, indigenous to Ireland and having risen up against the colonial power, was now presenting treaties to indigenous groups. At Fort Benton in 1865, Meagher and Justice Lyman Munson presented what would be the Blackfoot Treaty of 1865 to the Blackfeet and Gravant tribes, which would have had them drop their claims to the lands and put them into reservations. Meagher was somewhat critical of this treaty, which was never ratified by the Senate, noting that a comparatively small reservation is guaranteed to the original owners of this vast domain. Additionally, he wanted treaties to be renegotiated away from federally dictated terms, believing they would not succeed. However, in response to the infighting at Fort Benton that had begun between the tribes as a result of the treaty terms, Meagher was said to have told the tribal chiefs, "I will order my men to begin firing and not stop until every Indian is killed and the annuity goods restored to the government." No massacre occurred, thankfully. Additionally, Meagher sought to raise a militia against native groups in the Gallatin Valley in response to the death of John Bozeman, allegedly killed by Blackfeet natives. What about his values? You could be an ineffective governor but have values worth remembering. Gary Forney, in his book on Mar, wrote that he fought to bring political order, establish his church, add a bit of elegance and infuse others with his dream of a glorious future for Montana. Mike O'Connor from the Helena chapter of the Ancient Order of Hibernians said in an interview with KTVH that, quote, he was fighting for all of Montana, not just the political party, but all of Montana. My interpretation of this statue of Thomas Francis Meagher, this public memory to him, is largely influenced by my own personal or private memory. Even recognizing the negative aspects of his tenure, or even the problematic aspects of his tenure, in my mind I'm able to weigh that out because I know of his contributions to part of who I am, to part of my identity, that is, being Irish. Seeing him makes me proud to be Irish. It also makes me proud to be an American. It makes me proud to have spent part of my life in Montana. I was there for 2.5 years, he was there for only 2. He died, I lived. Other than that, it seems like we're basically the same person. Another thing that's influencing my interpretation of this statue is what went into making this project. It was as much driving out to Helena to go see it and get the footage as it was just spending time with very good friends of mine in a place that I'd used to live, but seeing places within the state that I'd never been before. Most of the footage is just us driving down anonymous county roads that were completely empty. So now I associate Thomas Francis Meagher and this statue with hanging with my buddies. I would say that I disagree with the popular interpretation that this is as much a statue dedicated to the Irish of Montana as it is Thomas Francis Meagher. The only day this becomes more Irish than it is St. Patrick's Day, where they fly the tricolour out of the Capitol building. I do think that's pretty cool. But every other day of the year, this takes on a far more American identity. When it was unveiled in 1905, it was draped in the American flag. If you're looking at the Capitol building, which faces north, and you're looking at the statue, you're seeing him frontwards, and the information presented to you is his American contributions. Also, most Irish in Montana weren't like Thomas Francis Meagher. They would have been in places like Butte, and they would have been blue-collar miners. However, the creation of the statue was certainly an Irish endeavour. The initial call for a statue came from Irish-American House Representative Martin McGuinness, and the funding for the statue, provided by the Meagher Memorial Association out of Butte, received great help from Marcus Daly. Remember him? Also, the statue was sculpted by Irish-born Charles Mulligan. Like I said, seeing this statue of Thomas Francis Meagher makes me quite proud to have spent a small but formative period of my life in Montana, just like how Thomas Francis Meagher spent a small but formative period of his life there, albeit cut short. Additionally, just seeing this Irishman immortalized and knowing that he made his mark on the state, it also makes me proud to be Irish and to be American. He's not a rancher or some cowboy, even if he is on a horse. He's just one of the many Irish that made Montana the place that it is.